I don't have enough. Jimmy Henderson's voice was flat, almost embarrassed, as he patted down the pockets of his leather vest. I don't have my wallet. The manager's hand was already reaching for the phone. Then I'm calling the cops. Right now. Emily Carter didn't even look up from her papers when she said it. Put it on my card. Nobody in that diner, not the manager, not the cook watching through the kitchen window, not Jimmy himself understood that this one sentence was about to summon 180 motorcycles to a high school by morning. If you're watching this story unfold tonight, do me a favor and type the name of the city you're watching from down in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and I read every single one of them. Now, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is going to stay with you for a long, long time. Let's get into it. The diner was called Pops, and at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, it was the kind of empty that made every sound feel too loud. The buzz of the overhead lights, the hum of the refrigerator case by the register, the scratch of a red pen against paper. Emily Carter sat in the corner booth, the one under the flickering bulb that nobody had bothered to fix in 2 years, with a stack of junior year history essays in front of her and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She was 34 years old and she felt 50. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a knot that had stopped looking neat sometime around 6 o'clock that evening. Her cardigan had a coffee stain on the cuff she hadn't noticed yet. She wasn't grading papers because she wanted to. She was grading them because if she went home, she'd just sit in her apartment and stare at the stack of bills on the kitchen counter. And that felt worse than red ink and run-on sentences. The bell over the door jingled. Emily didn't look up. People came and went, from Pops all-night truckers, mostly the occasional insomniac. She was 3 sentences into a paragraph about the Missouri Compromise when she heard the booth across the aisle groan underweight, real weight, the kind of weight that made vinyl seats sound like they were filing a complaint. That's when she looked. The man filled the entire booth. He had to be 6'4", maybe taller shoulders, so wide he had to angle himself sideways just to slide all the way in. His arms were sleeves of ink, faded blue-green tattoos that told stories Emily couldn't read from across the room. His beard was gray and trimmed close, his hair slicked back and tucked under a worn leather skullcap. The vest he wore over a black t-shirt had patches on it, and even from 20 feet away, Emily could read the big one across the back. Hell's Angels. She felt her stomach tighten the way it always did around men like that. Not because she'd ever had trouble with bikers specifically, because she'd had trouble with men who took up space like they owned it, and this man took up space like the whole world was already his. The waitress, a tired woman named Donna who'd worked the night shift at Pops for longer than Emily had been a teacher, approached his table with the kind of forced cheerfulness that came from 20 years of customer service. "What can I get you, hon?" "Whatever's biggest," the man said. His voice was low, rough, like gravel dragged over concrete. "Burger, fries, the works, and coffee, black." "You got it." Emily went back to her papers. She told herself she wasn't watching him, but she was in the way you watch a storm cloud on the horizon, even when you're pretty sure it's heading the other direction. 20 minutes later, the food came. He ate like a man who hadn't eaten all day, methodical, and quiet, his eyes occasionally drifting to the window, to the parking lot, to the dark street beyond it. Emily noticed he never fully relaxed. Even eating a burger at midnight, some part of him was watching the exits. She went back to her essays. A student named Marcus had written 3 pages about the Civil War without once mentioning slavery, and she sat there with her pen hovering, trying to figure out how to write a comment that wouldn't crush a 16-year-old's confidence while still telling him the truth that he'd missed the entire point. That's when she heard the manager's voice rise. "Excuse me." The manager, a thin, balding man named Carl, who Emily had seen maybe a dozen times and never liked, was standing at the biker's table with his arms crossed. "Sir, the bill." The big man was patting his vest, then his jeans, then his vest again, like maybe the wallet would materialize on the second pass. "I don't have enough," he said. His voice was flat, almost embarrassed. "I don't have my wallet." Carl's face went from annoyed to something harder. "Then I'm calling the cops right now." "Sir, just give me a minute. I've heard that before, sir." Carl was already moving toward the register, his hand reaching for the phone mounted on the wall. "You people come in here, you eat, and then suddenly there's no wallet. I'm not doing this tonight." "You people." Emily felt something in her chest tighten at those 2 words. The biker's jaw flexed. His hands, which had been resting flat on the table, curled slightly, not into fists exactly, but close. "I'm not running out on the bill. I live 20 minutes from here. Let me leave my bike as collateral. Let me call somebody. I'm good for it." "Sure you are." Carl's hand was on the phone now. 911's real quick around here. You know that? The air in the diner changed. Emily felt it the way you feel a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Donna had backed up against the counter, her eyes wide. The cook had appeared at the kitchen window, wiping his hands nervously on a towel. The biker hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done a single threatening thing, and yet the entire room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see whether this would end in handcuffs or worse. Emily had spent 11 years in classrooms watching tension build between teenagers right before a fight broke out. She knew the signs, the stillness that wasn't calm, it was control. The way Carl's voice had gotten higher, more nervous, masking fear with aggression. The way the biker's eyes had gone flat and careful. A man calculating exactly how bad this could get and deciding for now to absorb the insult rather than answer it. She thought about Marcus's essay, about slavery, about history, about how easy it was to watch injustice happen in slow motion and tell yourself it wasn't your problem. She thought about every time in her life someone had looked at her and decided who she was before she opened her mouth, too young to be taken seriously, as a teacher, too soft to handle a classroom full of gang kids, too broke to matter. She stood up. Carl. Her voice surprised her with how steady it came out. How much is the bill? Carl blinked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. Emily, this isn't your how much. $18.50, Donna said quietly from behind the counter, eager to diffuse anything that might result in broken plates. Emily was already pulling her wallet out of her bag. She had exactly $41 to last her until Friday's paycheck. She set a 20 on the counter. Keep the change for Donna's tip, she said. The diner went silent in a different way now. Carl's mouth opened and closed. The biker turned in his booth, slow, deliberate, and looked at Emily for the first time. Up close, his eyes weren't what she expected. She'd expected hard, mean, maybe drunk. Instead, she found something tired. Something that looked almost like the exhaustion she saw in her own bathroom mirror every morning. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. Emily zipped her bag shut. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because she nodded at Carl without looking at him, was about 30 seconds from making a bad night a lot worse for no reason. Carl sputtered. Now hold on, I was just... You were about to call the police on a man for forgetting his wallet, Emily said, and something in her voice had teacher in it, now the same tone she used to shut down a hallway fight. That's not a crime, Carl. That's Tuesday. The biker watched her with an expression she couldn't read. Something complicated was happening behind those eyes. Something that looked like surprise wrestling with suspicion. Like a man trying to figure out the angle, trying to find the catch, and slowly realizing there wasn't one. What's your name? He asked. Emily hesitated. Some old instinct, some leftover voice from every safety seminar she'd ever sat through told her not to give it. But she was tired, and it was midnight, and she had 40 more essays to grade and rent due in 9 days, and none of that mattered more than the simple fact that she'd just done something true. Emily, she said. Emily Carter? He nodded slowly like he was filing it away somewhere permanent. Jimmy Henderson. Well, Jimmy Henderson, eat your fries before they get cold. She slid back into her booth and picked up her pen like nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. Carl stood frozen by the register, his ego too bruised to apologize, too embarrassed to keep arguing. Donna gave Emily a small, grateful smile from across the room, and Jimmy Henderson sat very still in his booth, watching the blonde woman in the coffee-stained cardigan go back to grading papers, like she hadn't just done something that in his world was not small at all. In Jimmy's world, debts were sacred. You didn't forget who helped you when you were down. You didn't forget who stood between you and trouble for no reason, except that it was the right thing to do. He finished his fries slowly. He drank his coffee slower. He watched Emily Carter for almost 20 more minutes, watched her circle sentences, watched her rub her eyes when she thought no one was looking, watched the particular exhaustion of someone carrying more weight than they let on. When he finally stood to leave, he paused beside her booth. Emily looked up. Thank you, he said, 2 words. No flourish, no charm, nothing performative about it. You're welcome. She almost smiled. Get home safe. He nodded once. Then he walked out into the parking lot, and a moment later, Emily heard the unmistakable thunder of a motorcycle engine roaring to life, the sound rattling the diner's windows before fading into the night. She didn't think much more about it. She finished Marcus's essay, wrote a comment about primary sources in perspective that took her 10 minutes to get right, and packed up her bag a little after 1 in the morning. She had no idea walking out to her 7-year-old Honda in the empty parking lot that the man she just helped didn't forget kindness. He collected it like a debt owed, and Jimmy Henderson always paid his debts. Roosevelt High School sat on the east side of a city that had stopped pretending it could fix itself. The building had been beautiful once 80 years ago with its brick facade and tall windows and a bell tower that didn't ring anymore because some kid had broken the mechanism back in 2019 and the district never had the money to fix it. Emily pulled into the staff lot at 7:15 the next morning, her eyes gritty from 4 hours of sleep, a granola bar serving as breakfast because that was all she had time for. She taught American history at Roosevelt for 6 years. She'd watched it slide from struggling to surviving to something closer to a war zone with a school bell. The metal detectors at the front entrance had been installed her second year. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Reggie, who Emily genuinely liked, gave her a tired nod as she walked through. "Morning, Ms. Carter." "Morning, Reggie. Quiet so far." Reggie's eyes flicked toward the east hallway, toward the cluster of boys in red bandanas loitering by the lockers, and Emily understood his silence perfectly. Quiet was relative at Roosevelt High. The East Side Kings had been operating in and around the school for almost 3 years now. What started as a handful of older brothers and cousins running small-time stuff on the corner had metastasized into something that controlled entire hallways, extorted lunch money from freshmen, and made sure everyone, students, teachers, the principal himself understood who really ran the building between 8 and 3. Emily made her way to her classroom room 214 and found Tyler Brooks already waiting outside her door, hunched against the wall, a fresh bruise blooming under his left eye. "Tyler." Emily's voice softened immediately, the teacher voice falling away into something more like a worried aunt. "What happened?" "Nothing." He wouldn't look at her. He was 15, skinny, the kind of kid who carried 3 different library books at once because reading was the only place he felt safe. "I fell." "Tyler." "I fell, Ms. Carter." His eyes finally met hers, and there was a warning in them, a plea, really. "Don't make this worse. Please." Emily had been down this road enough times to know push too hard and you lose them entirely. She unlocked her door instead. "Come sit in here until the bell rings. I've got ice in my desk." She always kept ice in her desk, a small cooler restocked every week, because at Roosevelt High, a teacher who didn't keep first aid supplies on hand was a teacher who wasn't paying attention. Tyler sat at the front desk pressing the cold pack to his cheek while Emily set up for first period. "Was it the Kings?" she asked quietly, not looking at him, giving him the dignity of not having to make eye contact with the question. A long silence. Then barely audible, "They want me to carry something. In my backpack. Between classes." Emily's hand stilled on her desk. "Carry what?" "I don't know. I didn't look. I said no. And Marcus, not your Marcus, the other one, Deshaun's cousin, he said I'd regret it." Tyler's voice cracked slightly. "I regretted it." Emily crouched down so she was at his eye level again. "Tyler, listen to me. You did the right thing saying no. Do you hear me? Mr. Patterson said not to get involved in gang stuff." Tyler's voice carried a bitterness too old for a 15-year-old. "He said it's above his pay grade." Principal Patterson. Of course he did. Emily had heard some version of that sentence in 3 different staff meetings this year alone. The district had cut 2 security positions for budget reasons last spring, right around the same time the East Side Kings had expanded their territory inside the building. Nobody in the front office wanted to call it what it was, a school slowly being handed over to people who didn't belong inside it. "I'm going to talk to someone," Emily said. "Don't." Tyler's eyes went wide with real fear now. "Please don't say anything came from me." "I won't use your name. I promise." Emily stood smoothing her skirt, feeling the familiar cocktail of rage and helplessness that had become as routine to her mornings as coffee. "Just keep that ice on it. And Tyler, if anyone asks you to carry anything again, you come find me first. Not after, before." The bell rang. Tyler slipped out into the hallway just as the first wave of students began flooding in, loud and tired and teenage, completely unaware that their history teacher had spent the last 6 minutes trying to keep one of them from drowning. By third period, the day had already worn Emily down to a thin edge. She was midway through a lesson on the Reconstruction era when she heard shouting from the hallway, the unmistakable rhythm of a fight, building the slap of sneakers, the rising chorus of "oh" from a crowd of phones already filming. "Stay in your seats," Emily said to her class and walked out into the hallway before she'd fully decided to. 2 boys were circling each other near the lockers, but it wasn't really a fight, not yet. One was a Kings affiliate, the kind of kid Emily recognized by his walk before she ever saw his face. The other was smaller, a sophomore named Aaron, who Emily had taught the year before, backed against a locker with his hands up defensively. Give me the bag, the king's kid was saying low and mean. Last time I asked. Emily stepped directly between them. It was instinct more than strategy, the same instinct that had stood her up in a diner booth 12 hours earlier. Class is in session, she said, her voice carrying the particular authority she'd spent 11 years building. Both of you names now. Ms. Carter, this ain't your business. The boy's eyes were hard-performing toughness for the small crowd that had gathered. It became my business the moment it happened in my hallway. She didn't move. Her heart was hammering, but she'd learned a long time ago that showing fear to a teenager performing dominance only made things worse. You can walk away right now, or I can walk you to Mr. Patterson's office myself. Your choice. A long beat. The crowd watched. Phone stayed up recording. The boy spat near her feet, not on her, near her. A calculated insult that stopped just short of an actual offense and walked away muttering something Emily chose not to hear clearly. Aaron exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. Thank you, Ms. Carter, he whispered. Go to class, Aaron. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking as she walked back into her classroom, and she pressed them flat against her thighs so her students wouldn't see. This was Roosevelt High. This was every day. And every day Emily Carter walked back into it anyway because somebody had to. And increasingly it felt like she was the only one who still believed that. That afternoon in the front office, she finally cornered Principal Patterson between his second and third meeting of the day. We need more security, she said without preamble. I had a kid with a black eye this morning who's being pressured to run something through the building. I broke up an extortion attempt in the hallway during third period. This is escalating, and if we don't do something— Emily. Patterson held up a hand, the universal gesture of a man who'd already decided the conversation was over before it started. I hear you, I do. But the district cut our security budget 11% last year. I don't have the bodies. I don't have the funding. What do you want me to do? I want you to call the police. I want you to call the district. I want you to do something other than hope it goes away. You think I haven't called the police? Patterson's voice had an edge of exhaustion that mirrored her own. You think this is news to anyone? The Kings have been operating 3 blocks from here 4 years. The cops know. The district knows. Nobody's got the resources or the political will to actually fix it, Emily. We're a public school in a neighborhood nobody with power lives in. That's the whole equation. So we just let it happen. We survive it. That's different. He rubbed his eyes. I know that's not the answer you want. It's not the answer I want either. But I've got 200 staff members and 1,200 kids and a budget that covers about 60% of what we actually need. I am doing what I can. Emily left his office with her jaw tight, the same helpless fury she carried home most nights, the kind that made her stare at the ceiling at 2 a.m, wondering why she hadn't gone into literally any other profession. She didn't know, walking to her car that evening, exhausted and defeated in the particular way only a teacher at the end of a long day can be, that 12 hours earlier, she had set something in motion that no amount of district budget cuts or administrative cowardice could stop. She didn't know that Jimmy Henderson had already started making calls. Jimmy rode home that night with Emily Carter's name sitting in his chest like a coal that wouldn't go out. He pulled into the clubhouse a little after 1 a.m, a converted warehouse on the industrial side of town with a chain-link fence, motion lights, and 40 bikes parked in neat rows outside. Inside, the place smelled like motor oil and cigarette smoke, and Old Leather, the bar in the corner, still serving the handful of brothers who hadn't called it a night yet. Big Earl, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, a man even larger than Jimmy, with a beard down to his chest, looked up from his beer. You're back late. Got held up. Jimmy pulled a stool out and sat. Forgot my wallet at a diner. Earl raised an eyebrow. And some woman paid my bill. Jimmy stared at the bar top for a long moment. School teacher. Tired as hell, looked like she hadn't slept right in a year. Manager was about to call the cops on me for forgetting $40. She just stood up and paid it. Didn't ask for anything. Didn't even want my name at first. Earl set his beer down slowly. He'd ridden with Jimmy for almost 20 years. He knew that particular tone in his brother's voice, the one that meant something had lodged itself somewhere deep and wasn't coming loose. You got a name, Emily Carter. Jimmy was already pulling out his phone. Teaches at Roosevelt High, East Side. Roosevelt, Earl whistled low. That's King's territory. Whole school's basically theirs at this point from what I hear. Yeah. Jimmy's jaw tightened. That's what I'm finding out. He spent the next 2 hours on his phone quietly, methodically, the way Jimmy did everything. He had a cousin who worked dispatch for the city and owed him a favor. He had a prospect whose sister had graduated from Roosevelt 2 years back. By 2 in the morning, Jimmy Henderson knew more about Emily Carter than she probably would have been comfortable with, knew she'd been teaching for 11 years, knew she lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on a fifth, knew her salary was public record, and it made him angrier than he expected to see exactly how little this country paid the people who spent every day standing between children and chaos. He knew about the East Side Kings. He knew about the extortion, the intimidation, the slow rot eating through a building full of kids who hadn't done anything to deserve it. And he knew with the kind of certainty that had guided every important decision in his 30 years with the club that this wasn't something money could fix. Big Earl found him still sitting at the bar at 3 in the morning, phone dark now, staring at nothing. "You're quiet," Earl said. "I'm thinking." "About the teacher. About debts." Jimmy turned the empty coffee cup in his hands. "You know what she did tonight, Earl? She had no idea who I was. Didn't matter to her. She saw somebody about to get steamrolled over something small and stupid, and she stepped in. Didn't think twice. People do that sometimes. Not like this, not for a stranger, not when she's got nothing herself." Jimmy shook his head slowly. "And then I find out she does that every single day. Walks into a building full of kids getting eaten alive by gangs nobody's stopping, and she keeps showing up anyway. Keeps standing between them and the worst of it. Nobody's paying her enough to do that. Nobody's protecting her while she does it." Earl was quiet for a long moment, watching his old friend's face in the dim bar light. "What are you thinking, Jimmy?" Jimmy looked up, and there was something in his eyes that Earl had seen before, seen it the night Jimmy had organized the run for the burned-down veterans shelter. Seen it the time Three Angels had quietly handled a string of break-ins, terrorizing an elderly neighborhood while the cops did nothing. It was the look Jimmy got when a wrong had crossed some line inside him that couldn't be uncrossed. "I'm thinking," Jimmy said slowly, "that the East Side Kings have been running that school for 3 years because nobody's ever shown up who scared them more than they scared everybody else." Earl leaned back on his stool, a slow grin spreading under his beard. "You thinking what I think you're thinking? I'm thinking we owe Emily Carter a debt." Jimmy stood draining the last of his cold coffee. "And the Hells Angels don't pay debts in $20 bills." He walked to the chapter's old corkboard, the one where club business got posted, where runs got planned, where brothers signed up for charity rides and funeral escorts. He pulled a pen from his vest and wrote 3 words at the top of a blank sheet of paper. Roosevelt High School. Behind him, Big Earl was already reaching for his phone, already starting to make the first of what would become dozens of calls that night and into the morning calls to chapter residents, 2 counties over, calls to brothers who hadn't ridden together in months, calls that all carried some version of the same message. A debt needs paying, and it's going to take more than a few of us. By 4 in the morning, the word had spread through 3 chapters. By 5, confirmations were rolling in faster than Earl could write them down. And while Emily Carter slept fitfully in her one-bedroom apartment on 5th Street, dreaming the kind of shallow, anxious dreams that came from too much worry and not enough rest, 180 motorcycles across 4 counties were being fueled, checked, and prepared for a ride that would arrive at Roosevelt High School in just a few hours. None of them were coming for trouble. They were coming to settle a debt that money could never touch. And by the time the sun rose over the east side of the city, nothing at Roosevelt High would ever be the same again. By 5:30 in the morning, the staging lot off Route 9 looked like something out of a war film. Bikes lined up in columns, engines off men, checking saddlebags, tightening straps, lighting cigarettes with hands that didn't shake, even though most of them hadn't slept. Big Earl walked the rows with a clipboard counting heads from 4 chapters that had answered the call overnight. "We're at 162, he called out to Jimmy. "Got reports of 18 more coming up from the South chapter. Should put us right around 180 by the time we roll." 180. Jimmy repeated the number like he was tasting it. He stood beside his bike arms, crossed eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky was just starting to bruise purple before dawn. "That enough?" "Enough for what?" Earl asked. "We're not starting a war, Jimmy. We're making a statement." Same thing depending who's listening. A younger rider named Cole, no older than 25 patches, still stiff and new on his vest, sidled up nervous. "Jimmy, can I ask something?" "Go ahead." "We really doing this for a school teacher we don't know?" "Because she bought you a burger." The lot went quiet around them. A dozen older riders within earshot stopped what they were doing. Jimmy turned slowly, and his voice when it came was low and even, the kind of calm that carried further than shouting ever could. "Let me tell you something, Cole. Last night, a woman with $41 to her name looked at a man twice her size getting threatened with handcuffs over a forgotten wallet, and she didn't think about herself for 1 second. She thought about what was right. You understand how rare that is. Cole shifted his weight. I guess. You guess. Jimmy stepped closer. I've ridden with men for 30 years. I've seen brothers die for less reason than what she did without blinking. She works in a building where kids get extorted in the hallway and teachers get told to look the other way, and she keeps showing up anyway. That's not charity. That's character. And in this club, when somebody shows us character, we show up. The lot stayed silent for a long beat. Then somewhere in the back, an older rider named Frank, gray-bearded and quiet, started his engine. One by one, the others followed until the whole lot thundered with idling pipes, the sound rolling out over the empty fields like distant artillery. Cole swallowed hard and climbed onto his own bike. Yes, sir. Jimmy looked at Earl. Lead column ready. Ready when you are. Then let's go pay a debt. 20 minutes earlier, 3 miles east, Emily Carter's alarm had gone off at 5:45, same as every weekday, and she'd hit snooze twice before dragging herself upright with the particular heaviness of a woman who'd slept 4 hours and dreamed about hallway fights the whole time. She made coffee. She stared at the bills on the counter, did quick math in her head, and decided again that she'd figure out the electric bill on Thursday. She got dressed in the same gray cardigan she'd worn 3 days that week already because laundry was a Sunday problem, and it wasn't Sunday. She thought about Tyler Brooks' bruised eye. She thought about the boy who'd spat near her feet in the hallway. She thought just for a second about the massive biker from the diner the night before Jimmy, something she remembered and found herself almost smiling at the strange randomness of it, a moment of simple decency in an otherwise exhausting week. She had no idea that moment was about to detonate across the front of her school. By the time she pulled into the staff lot at 7:10, everything looked normal. Reggie at the metal detectors. Kids filing in loud and half asleep. The East Hallway crew already posted up by the lockers like they owned the place, because as far as anyone at Roosevelt High could tell, they did. Emily set up her classroom, wrote the day's date on the whiteboard, pulled up her lesson on Reconstruction-era voting rights, drank coffee from a thermos that had seen better decades. At 7:42, she heard it. At first, it was just a vibration. Something felt rather than heard, a low hum that rattled the window panes in their old frames. Emily looked up from her desk, frowning. A few students near the windows perked up too. What is that? Asked a girl in the front row. The hum became a rumble. The rumble became a roar. Ms. Carter! A boy near the window had stood up, pressing his face to the glass. Ms. Carter, you gotta see this. Emily crossed the room, and the moment she looked out the window, her stomach dropped through the floor. The street outside Roosevelt High was filling with motorcycles. Not 5, not 20. An endless river of them chrome catching the early morning sun. Leather and engines and noise stretching down the block in both directions. More bikes than Emily had ever seen in one place in her entire life. They moved in formation, disciplined, and deliberate, rolling to a stop in perfect rows along the curb around the corner, down the side street, until the entire perimeter of the school was boxed in by a wall of motorcycles and the men who rode them. Oh my God! The words came out of Emily in a whisper. Down the hallway, she could already hear the chaos building, lockers slamming, teachers shouting for students to stay calm, the unmistakable sound of Principal Patterson's voice cracking over the intercom. Attention staff and students. We are initiating a precautionary lockdown. Please remain in your classrooms. This is not a drill. The intercom clicked off, and immediately the room exploded into noise. Students scrambling for their phones, someone shrieking, a boy near the back, already filming through the window, was shaking hands. Everyone away from the windows! Emily's teacher voice kicked in instinctively, even as her own heart hammered against her ribs. Sit down now, away from the glass. But she couldn't make herself move from the window. Not yet, because down on the street, stepping off the lead bike, was a man she recognized instantly. A massive figure in a leather vest, gray beard trimmed close, the same man who'd sat across the aisle from her at Pop's Diner less than 12 hours earlier. Jimmy Henderson stood in the street, hands at his sides, looking up at the building like he was reading it floor by floor. He knows where I work. The thought hit Emily like ice water. Every safety seminar she'd ever sat through screamed at her at once stranger danger, gang retaliation. The 100 ways a kind gesture to the wrong person could come back as something far darker. Had she been wrong about him? Had paying for his meal somehow marked her, made her a target, painted a bullseye on the one school she'd spent 6 years trying to protect? Ms. Carter, are those the Hell's Angels? A student asked, voice trembling. Get away from the window, Emily said again, but her own legs wouldn't carry her backward. In the front office, pure pandemonium had broken loose. Principal Patterson stood at the window of his office, phone pressed to his ear, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cool morning. Yes, this is Roosevelt High. We need units here immediately. We have what appears to be 100 or more motorcycle gang members surrounding the building. No, I don't know what they want. They haven't approached the entrance. They're just... He paused, listening. What do you mean units are already en route? Who called it in? Down the hall, Reggie, the security guard, stood frozen at his post by the metal detectors, watching through the glass double doors as the bikers dismounted in eerie, coordinated silence. No shouting, no weapons drawn, no chaos at all, which somehow made it more terrifying, the sheer discipline of it, the sense that whatever was about to happen was being controlled by people who knew exactly what they were doing. A young teacher's aide ran past Patterson's office in tears. They're going to attack the school. Oh my God, they're going to attack the school. Nobody is attacking anybody until we know more, Patterson barked, though his own hands were shaking as he dialed the district superintendent's number with fumbling fingers. Outside, Jimmy Henderson hadn't moved from his spot in the middle of the street. Big Earl stood at his right shoulder, surveying the building's windows where dozens of terrified faces now peered out from behind glass. They think we're here to burn the place down, Earl said quietly. Let them think it a minute longer. Jimmy's eyes were scanning the building's east side, where he could see a cluster of teenagers in red bandanas had gathered near a side exit frozen mid-step, clearly trying to decide whether to bolt or hold their ground. Look at that. 3 years running this school, and the second real power shows up, they don't know what to do with themselves. Kings, Jimmy's jaw set hard. Get a count on them. I want eyes on every one of them that's visible. Sirens were already wailing in the distance, 2 then 4, then what sounded like half the city's patrol fleet converging on a single block. Jimmy didn't flinch. He'd expected that. 180 motorcycles outside a high school was never going to go unnoticed, and that was in its own way exactly the point. The first squad car screeched to a halt at the edge of the bike formation. An officer climbed out, hand hovering near his holster, voice raised. Sir, I need you to state your business here right now. Jimmy turned to face him, unhurried hand open and visible. Officer, my name is Jimmy Henderson. I'm here to speak with a teacher at this school. Nobody's armed. Nobody's here for trouble. You can search every bike on this street if you want. A teacher? The officer's eyes narrowed, clearly skeptical of a 180-strong motorcycle gang assembling outside an elementary school over a parent-teacher conference. Which teacher? Emily Carter. The name hung in the air. The officer's radio crackled, more units arriving, more sirens, stacking on top of each other, and for a moment the entire street felt suspended between two outcomes, violence or something else entirely. Back inside, the lockdown had reached its peak hysteria. In room 214, students were huddled along the far wall as instructed, but the windows were impossible to ignore, especially when the sirens started. It's the cops, someone said. They're gonna shoot them. Shut up, Marcus. Emily's voice was sharper than she meant it, fear bleeding through her authority. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to think like the adult in the room, even though every instinct screamed at her to panic right alongside her students. Her phone buzzed. A text from her colleague, Mrs. Alvarez, 2 doors down. They're saying it's not an attack. Cops are talking to them. Nobody's drawn a weapon. Emily's thumbs hovered over the screen, unsure what to even ask. She looked back out the window one more time, just in time to see Jimmy Henderson say something to the officer, calm, unhurried, and then point directly toward the building, toward her window. Emily's blood went cold. A moment later, the classroom phone rang. The old beige intercom phone mounted by the door. The one that almost never got used except for emergencies. Emily's entire class went silent, watching her cross the room and lift the receiver with a hand that wasn't quite steady. This is Carter. It was Patterson's secretary voice, pitched with barely controlled panic. Emily, Miss Carter, Principal Patterson needs you in the front office. Now, Me? Why me? What's? He says it's about the bikers outside. He says they're asking for you by name. The floor seemed to tilt slightly under Emily's feet. 20 pairs of teenage eyes were locked on her face, watching every flicker of emotion she failed to hide. Ms. Carter, whispered the girl in the front row, why do they want you? Emily didn't have an answer. She set the phone down slowly, her mind racing through every possibility, none of them good. Had she misjudged Jimmy entirely? Was this retaliation for something she didn't even understand, some biker code she'd unknowingly violated by being kind to the wrong man at the wrong diner? "Stay here," she told her class, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mrs. Alvarez is right next door if you need anything. I mean it, nobody leaves this room." She walked out into the hallway, and the silence there was its own kind of horror. Empty corridors, lockers shut tight, distant sirens bleeding through the windows. Every classroom door closed, every face she passed through narrow door windows pale with fear, watching her walk alone toward whatever waited at the front of the building. By the time she reached the front office, Patterson was waiting for her, his face the color of old paper. "Emily," his voice cracked slightly. "There's a man outside, big guy, leather vest, says his name is Jimmy Henderson. He's telling his police he's here to see you specifically. The Hells Angels are demanding to speak with you." "Demanding," Emily repeated faintly. "That's the word the officer used, yes." Patterson swallowed hard. "Do you know this man?" Emily's mouth had gone completely dry. She thought about the diner, the bill, the way Jimmy had looked at her before he left something heavy and unreadable in his eyes. "I met him once," she said slowly. "Last night, at a diner. I paid for his meal. He'd forgotten his wallet, and the manager was about to call the police on him." Patterson's eyes widened to an almost comical degree. "You paid for a Hells Angels meal, and the next morning, 180 of them showed up at our school. I didn't know who he was beyond what was on his vest. I didn't think—" Emily's voice trailed off because there was no good way to finish that sentence. She hadn't thought, period. She'd just acted the same instinct that had her stepping into hallway fights and giving Tyler ice packs and standing between trouble and people who didn't deserve it. "Well," Patterson exhaled shakily, running a hand over his thinning hair, "I suppose we're about to find out what that bill cost you." Through the front office windows, Emily could see the police had formed a loose perimeter, but nobody had drawn a weapon. Nobody had moved to arrest anyone. The energy outside had shifted somehow from imminent threat to something more like a standoff. Both sides watching, waiting, uncertain what came next. "They're not attacking," Emily said slowly, almost to herself. "Look at them, Patterson. They're not even agitated. They're just standing there." Standing there with 180 motorcycles outside an elementary school. Patterson snapped, panic finally breaking through his composure. "Forgive me if that doesn't reassure me." A young officer pushed through the front doors, breathing hard eyes, scanning the office until they landed on Emily. "Ma'am, are you Emily Carter?" Emily's heart hammered. "Yes. The man outside is asking to speak with you directly. He says it's important. He says—" The officer hesitated, clearly aware of how strange the next words were going to sound. "He says he owes you a debt, and he intends to pay it." The office went utterly silent. Patterson stared at Emily like she'd grown a second head. The secretary had stopped typing entirely. "A debt," Emily repeated. "That's what he said, ma'am." Emily looked toward the front doors, toward the wall of leather and chrome visible through the glass, toward the man who'd promised her nothing the night before, and yet had apparently spent the hours since assembling what looked like a small army outside her school. She thought about Tyler's bruised eye, about the Kings controlling her hallways, about every administrator and every district official who'd told her in a dozen different ways that this was simply how things were and nothing could be done. And for the first time all morning, underneath the fear, something else stirred in Emily Carter's chest, something that felt dangerously, impossibly like hope. "I'll talk to him," she said. "Emily, you don't have to—" Patterson started. "I know." She was already moving toward the door, her legs steadier now than they had any right to be. "But I think I started this. I think it's only fair I finish it." The officer escorted her toward the front entrance, past Reggie's frozen post at the metal detectors, past windows full of terrified students and teachers pressed against the glass, watching their history teacher walk toward 180 bikers, like she was walking toward the edge of the world. When the front doors opened and morning light spilled across the entrance steps, Emily Carter stepped outside into the middle of the most terrifying, most extraordinary moment of her entire life, and found Jimmy Henderson already walking toward her, his expression unreadable, the entire street behind him gone completely, deliberately silent. Emily's legs carried her down the steps before her brain fully agreed to the decision, and the closer she got to Jimmy Henderson, the more she became aware of every single eye on her students pressed against windows, officers with hands hovering near their belts, 180 bikers standing in absolute silence, like the whole street was holding its breath. Jimmy stopped a few feet away. Up close in daylight, he looked even bigger than he had in the booth at Pops, but his face wasn't hard the way she'd braced for. It was almost gentle. Emily. Just her name said the way you'd greet someone you'd known for years, not someone you'd shared $18.50 worth of history with 12 hours earlier. Jimmy? Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her pulse was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. You want to tell me why there are 180 motorcycles outside my school? 182, actually, Earl corrected quietly from behind Jimmy's shoulder. South chapter brought two more than expected. Emily blinked at him, then back at Jimmy. That wasn't really the part I was confused about. A ripple of something almost like amusement passed through the nearest riders, quickly suppressed. Jimmy's mouth twitched just barely. Nobody's here to hurt anybody, Jimmy said, his voice carrying further than he probably intended, loud enough for the officers nearby to hear, loud enough for the windows full of frightened faces above them. I want that understood right now by everybody listening. Not one person in this club has a weapon drawn. Not one person came here looking for trouble. The lead officer, a stocky man with a name tag reading Delgado, stepped closer, hand still resting near his holster. Then you mind explaining what exactly you did come here for, because I've got a building full of terrified kids and a superintendent blowing up my phone. Jimmy turned to him unhurried. Last night, this woman paid a bill for a stranger when the manager was fixing to call the cops over a forgotten wallet. She didn't ask my name, didn't ask for anything back, just did the decent thing, because it was the decent thing to do. He paused, letting that land. In my world, officer, that's not nothing. That's a debt. And debts get paid. By bringing a small army to a high school, Delgado's eyebrows climbed. By making sure everybody watching understands she's not alone anymore. Jimmy's eyes shifted just for a second toward the east side of the building, toward the cluster of red bandanas Emily knew without looking were still huddled by the side exit, frozen uncertain. I did some asking around last night, found out Ms. Carter here teaches in a building that's been bled dry by a gang running these halls for 3 years. While the people supposed to protect these kids keep telling her it's above their pay grade. Emily's breath caught. How do you know about that? I know things, Ms. Carter. It's what I do. Jimmy's gaze swept the street, slow and deliberate, taking in the windows, the officers, the visible tension radiating from the east side exit doors. I know your principal's been told to look the other way. I know a kid named Tyler got pressured to carry something through these halls and got a black eye for saying no. I know you've been standing between these children and people who'd hurt them for 3 years with nobody backing you up. The air left Emily's lungs in a rush. How could you possibly know about Tyler? Word travels fast when you know who to ask. Jimmy's expression didn't change, but something in his voice hardened. And I'll tell you something else I know, Emily. Things like that don't get better on their own. They get worse. Every single time. Officer Delgado's radio crackled with updates, more units staging 2 blocks over a captain, demanding status, the superintendent reportedly already en route. The whole situation was a powder keg with too many lit matches standing around it, and everyone on that street could feel it. Sir, Delgado said carefully, I'm going to need you to start moving these motorcycles off school property. We can discuss whatever debt you think you owe somewhere that isn't surrounding a building full of minors. We're not on school property, Jimmy said evenly. We're on a public street. Every bike here is parked legally. Nobody's trespassing, nobody's threatening anybody, and the second you can show me, otherwise I'll move every single one of these bikes myself. Delgado's jaw tightened because Jimmy was right and they both knew it. That's when it happened. A commotion broke out near the east exit, shouting the scrape of a door thrown open too hard, and 4 boys in red bandanas came spilling out onto the side lawn, clearly trying to use the chaos of the lockdown to slip away unnoticed. One of them, Alder, maybe 19, the kind of presence Emily recognized instantly as a King's lieutenant, froze the second he saw the wall of motorcycles blocking every direction out. Oh, hell no, the boy muttered, loud enough to carry. Every head on that street turned at once. Jimmy's eyes locked onto the group with a stillness that made Emily's skin prickle. Well, he said quietly, almost to himself, speak of the devil. The King's lieutenant Emily recognized him now. A young man named Deshawn, who'd been suspended twice last year for things the administration never quite specified, tried to play at cool hands, sliding into his pockets, chin lifted in practiced defiance. This some kind of joke, he called out, eyes scanning the rows of bikes, the leather, the patches. Y'all lost or something? Nobody answered him. A dozen riders had quietly shifted position, not aggressively, not even visibly, but enough that the 4 boys found themselves somehow more boxed in than they'd been 30 seconds earlier. Deshawn, Jimmy said the name like he'd known it his whole life, and the boy's bravado flickered just slightly at hearing a stranger know exactly who he was. How you know my name? Same way I know about Tyler Brooks's eye. Same way I know about the lunch money in the backpack you tried to load him up with yesterday morning. Jimmy hadn't raised his voice once, and somehow that made it worse, made the silence around them feel heavier, more dangerous than any shouting could have. Same way I know you and your boys have been running this hallway like it's yours for 3 years, while these kids had nobody to stand between them and you. Deshaun's eyes flicked toward his three friends, then back to Jimmy, calculating the gears visibly turning. We don't know what you're talking about, man. Sure you do. Jimmy took one slow step forward. Officer Delgado tensed hand drifting toward his radio, but didn't move to intervene yet, watching the dynamics shift with something like fascination. Let me ask you something, son. You ever think about what happens when somebody bigger than you decides your little operations run its course? Is that a threat? Deshaun's voice cracked slightly on the word, the bravado finally slipping. It's a fact. Jimmy's voice dropped lower, slower, every word landing with weight. You've spent 3 years scaring 15-year-olds out of their lunch money. 3 years making teachers afraid to walk their own hallways. You built your whole reputation on being the biggest thing in a building full of children. He gestured slow and deliberate at the wall of leather and chrome surrounding them on every side. Take a good look around, Deshaun. You're not the biggest thing here anymore. For one suspended electric moment, nobody moved. Emily realized she'd stopped breathing entirely. Officer Delgado's hand had finally settled on his radio, ready to call for backup if this tipped sideways, but something in the stillness of the bikers told him it wasn't going to. Then Deshaun's nerve broke. This ain't over, he muttered, already backing toward the nearest gap in the formation, his three friends scrambling after him. Y'all don't run this neighborhood. No, Jimmy agreed calmly, not bothering to stop them. We don't run the neighborhood. We just made sure everybody watching understands exactly how small your little kingdom really is. The four boys disappeared down the side street at something close to a run, and the moment they vanished around the corner, a strange sound rippled through the crowd, gathered behind the school's windows. Something between a gasp and a cheer muffled by glass but unmistakable. Emily turned and saw faces pressed against every window on that side of the building. Students who'd just watched in real time the gang that had terrorized their hallways for 3 years turn and flee from a man who'd barely raised his voice. She felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for 6 straight years. That's it, Emily said, almost in disbelief. That's been controlling this entire school for 3 years. Bullies are only as big as the silence around them, Jimmy said simply. Nobody's ever made noise loud enough to scare them before. Officer Delgado finally stepped forward, clearly trying to reassert some control over a situation that had spiraled entirely outside his expectations. All right, nobody's been hurt, nothing's been damaged, and apparently you just scared off 4 kids who probably had warrants out anyway. He exhaled hard. But I still need this resolved. I need these motorcycles gone within the hour, and I need to understand exactly what you think you're accomplishing here. Fair enough. Jimmy nodded, then turned back to Emily, and something in his expression softened in a way that caught her completely off guard after the cold authority he'd just shown Deshaun. Emily, can we talk just for a minute? Somewhere your principal won't have a heart attack watching. Emily glanced back at the building where Patterson stood frozen in the front office window, phone still pressed to his ear, looking like a man whose entire understanding of his job had just been rewritten in real time. There's a bench by the flagpole, she said. He can probably still see us from there, but at least he won't be able to hear. They walked together, the crowd of bikers, parting silently to let them pass, dozens of eyes following, without a single word spoken. Emily was acutely aware of how strange this looked, the exhausted history teacher in her coffee-stained cardigan, walking beside a mountain of a man covered in patches and tattoos, like 2 characters who'd wandered in from completely different stories. They sat, the flagpole's chain clinked softly in the morning breeze, the only sound besides distant sirens finally beginning to fade as officers realized slowly that no crime was actually being committed. I need you to understand something. Jimmy said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority he'd used on Deshaun. What I did last night asking around about you, I know that probably feels invasive. I know it probably scared you, finding out a stranger you helped for $18 went and learned your whole life story overnight. It did, Emily admitted. It really did. I'm not going to apologize for it because I do it again, but I want you to understand why. Jimmy stared out at the rows of bikes at the brothers who'd ridden through the night for a debt that had nothing to do with money. I've been in this club 30 years, Emily. You learn things riding with men for that long. You learn who talks tough and who actually means it. You learn the difference between somebody doing something because it'll be seen and somebody doing something because it's just who they are. And you think I'm the second kind. I know you're the second kind. Jimmy turned to look at her directly. You didn't know who I was last night. For all you knew, I was exactly the kind of trouble that manager was worried about. You stood up anyway. That's not a decision people make. That's just who you are. Emily felt something tighten in her throat, an unexpected wave of emotion she hadn't braced for. 6 years of feeling invisible, 6 years of being told her concerns were above somebody's pay grade, 6 years of fighting a losing battle in a building everyone else had quietly given up on. And now a stranger was sitting beside her, naming exactly what that felt like, as though he'd been watching the whole time. It's been a long 6 years, she admitted quietly. I keep waiting for somebody to actually fix what's broken here. The administration won't. The district can't or won't. I'm honestly not sure which anymore. The cops show up after things happen never before. I just keep trying to be the wall between these kids and the worst of it because I don't know what else to do. You shouldn't have to be the only wall. I don't have a choice. You do now. Jimmy's voice carried a quiet finality that made Emily's pulse jump. Those boys that ran a minute ago, they're not coming back. Not to this school. Not while I'm breathing. Emily turned to face him, fully searching his expression for some hint of exaggeration, some performative toughness, like she'd seen from Deshawn 10 minutes earlier. She found none, just absolute unshakable certainty. Jimmy, I appreciate the gesture I do more than you probably realize. But you can't park motorcycles outside of school forever. The Kings aren't going to disappear because they got scared once. You let me worry about that. Jimmy reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases like it had been handled by a dozen different hands overnight. This isn't a one-time thing, Emily. This is a club making a decision together as of about 3 in the morning. Roosevelt High is under our protection now. Not because you asked for it, because you earned it without ever knowing you were earning anything at all. Emily took the paper with hands that weren't quite steady, unfolding it slowly. Her eyes scanned down a list of names, dozens of them, chapter affiliations scrawled beside each one, a rotating schedule already beginning to take shape. What is this? A watch schedule, Jimmy said. We've got brothers who'll be in the area regular as clockwork mornings and afternoon school days. Nothing dramatic, nothing that'll scare your students worse than they already are. Just enough presence that anybody thinking about running drugs or extortion through these halls thinks twice. Emily stared at the list, her mind struggling to catch up with the sheer scope of what was being offered. Jimmy, I don't even know what to say to this. You don't have to say anything. Jimmy stood brushing off his jeans, glancing back toward the building, where Patterson was now visible standing in the front doorway, clearly summoning the courage to come find out exactly what was happening on his school's front lawn. Looks like your principal's about to come and ask me some very uncomfortable questions. Emily looked down at the paper one more time, at the dozens of names representing a kind of protection she'd never once imagined possible, and felt something shift permanently inside her chest. Something that had been braced and defensive for 6 straight years, finally cautiously allowing itself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Jimmy. She stood too, folding the paper carefully into her cardigan pocket like something precious. Why really? You could have just thanked me last night and ridden away. You didn't owe me anything close to this. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, watching the building, watching the windows still full of curious, frightened, increasingly fascinated student faces. Because somebody showed me kindness when they had every reason not to, he said finally. And in my whole life, Emily, I've learned that kind of thing is rare enough you don't let it pass without answering it properly. You think this is about a hamburger. He shook his head slowly. It was never about the hamburger. Behind them, Principal Patterson had finally worked up the nerve to approach his expression, a complicated mixture of relief, confusion, and barely restrained panic, just as a fresh commotion stirred near the side of the building. Not the Kings this time, but a cluster of students who'd somehow slipped past the lockdown protocols, entirely pressing toward the windows nearest the flagpole phones raised. Already streaming live to followers who had no idea they were witnessing the exact moment Roosevelt High School's 6-year nightmare began impossibly to end. Patterson reached them at a half-jog tie, loosened color, finally returning to his face now that no shots had been fired and no buildings had burned. Ms. Carter, I need you to explain to me right now what exactly I'm looking at. Principal Patterson, this is Jimmy Henderson. Emily's voice was steadier than she expected, the folded paper still tucked against her ribs, like something she needed to protect. He's here because I paid for his dinner last night. Patterson blinked again. I'm sorry, what? It's a long story, Jimmy said, extending a hand the size of a dinner plate. Short version, sir, your teacher did something decent for a stranger, and where I come from, decent doesn't go unanswered. Patterson stared at the offered hand for a beat too long before shaking it, clearly still processing the fact that a man who could probably crush his fingers without trying was being, for all appearances, polite. And the unanswered part requires 180 motorcycles. 182, Earl corrected again from a few feet back, earning a tired glance from Jimmy. The point is, Jimmy continued, I did some digging last night, found out this school's been bleeding for 3 years under a gang nobody's had the resources or the nerve to push out. Found out your teachers are getting black eyes trying to protect kids, while the district tells them it's above their pay grade. His eyes settled on Patterson with a weight that made the principal visibly shrink an inch. That sound about right to you? Patterson's jaw worked silently for a moment, the practiced deflections he'd used on Emily 100 times, suddenly feeling inadequate in front of a man who clearly already knew every uncomfortable truth before he asked the question. It's not inaccurate, he admitted, finally quietly. We've requested additional security funding 3 times this year. It's been denied 3 times. Then maybe it's time somebody other than the district stepped in. Jimmy's voice carried no malice, just plain fact. We're not asking permission, Mr. Patterson. We're informing you. This school has our attention now. You'll see brothers around mornings and afternoons, nothing dramatic. Consider it neighborhood watch with better bikes. Before Patterson could formulate a response to that, a fresh wave of commotion rippled through the crowd of students still pressed against the windows. Emily turned just in time to see a cluster of red bandanas reappearing at the far end of the block. Not Deshaun and his 3 friends this time, but a larger group, 8 or 9 boys moving with the deliberate swagger of people trying to reclaim something that had just been taken from them in front of an audience. Oh no, Emily breathed. Big Earl had already noticed his posture shifting instantly from relaxed to alert. Jimmy turned and Emily watched something in his expression go utterly still, the easy warmth from moments earlier replaced by something colder, more calculating. I see them. The Kings approached the edge of the bike formation with far more bravado than the situation warranted, clearly having spent the last 15 minutes regrouping, calling in reinforcements, deciding collectively that retreat wasn't an option they could survive socially. At the front walked a man Emily didn't recognize, older than the others, maybe mid-20s, with a presence that immediately marked him as something more senior than Deshaun. That's Marcus Webb, Patterson said under his breath, color draining from his face all over again. Deshaun's cousin. He doesn't usually come around the school directly. He runs things from a distance. Not today, apparently, Jimmy muttered. Marcus Webb stopped at the edge of the bike formation, hands loose at his sides, eyes scanning the rows of leather-clad men with a calculation Emily found genuinely frightening. Heard there was some confusion out here, he called out, voice pitched loud enough to carry to the windows above, clearly performing for an audience of his own. Heard somebody scared off some kids that don't even run nothing. Funny, Jimmy said, stepping forward to meet him, because that's not the story I heard. Yeah, Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. What story you hear? I heard 4 boys ran like hell the second they realized this street wasn't theirs to play in anymore. Jimmy's voice carried easily across the now silent crowd. I heard you came down here personally because that scared you more than you're willing to admit out loud. A murmur rippled through the gathered Kings behind Marcus. Officer Delgado, who'd been monitoring the situation from a careful distance, started moving closer again, radio already keyed, sensing exactly how fast this could deteriorate. You don't know nothing about what scares me, Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. I know you've been running this school for 3 years off fear, and nothing else, Jimmy replied evenly. I know the second something bigger than you showed up, your whole operation folded like wet paper. I know you're standing here right now trying to save face in front of a building full of kids who just watched your cousin run away from a conversation he started. Emily felt her pulse hammering as the tension between the 2 men stretched tighter, the entire street holding its breath, students filming from every visible window. Patterson frozen beside her with his phone still clutched uselessly in one hand. Then something extraordinary happened. A side door of the school burst open and Tyler Brooks, small, skinny, bruised-eyed Tyler Brooks, the boy who'd begged Emily not to say anything that morning, came stumbling out onto the lawn, having apparently slept, past whatever supervision remained during the chaos, his face a mixture of terror and something that looked almost like courage. "He made me carry it," Tyler shouted, pointing directly at Marcus Webb, his voice cracking with the kind of fear that comes right before someone finally stops being afraid. "Last month, he made me carry a bag through the cafeteria and said if I told anybody, he said he'd hurt my little sister." The entire street went dead silent. Emily's heart seized in her chest. Tyler, no. But it was too late. The words were out, hanging in the morning air, and Marcus Webb's face had transformed from performative confidence into something far uglier, far more dangerous. "Shut your mouth, you little—" "Don't!" Jimmy's voice cut through the air like a blade, and the single word carried enough force that Marcus actually flinched, actually took a half step back before catching it himself. "Don't you dare finish that sentence anywhere near that child. This ain't your business, old man." Marcus's composure was cracking visibly now. The audience of phones and frightened faces, clearly not the dynamic he'd planned for. "This is between me and that little snitch." "Wrong." Jimmy took one more step forward, close enough now that the height difference between them was almost comedic, except nothing about his expression was funny at all. "That boy just stood in front of 180 witnesses and told the truth about what you did to him. You want to threaten a child's little sister in front of police officers, in front of cameras, in front of every single person on this street." Marcus's eyes darted to the side to Officer Delgado, now standing close enough to have heard every word radio already pressed to his lips, calling for backup with real urgency this time. "This isn't over." Marcus said the same useless phrase his cousin had used minutes earlier, except this time it sounded even hollower. "You're right," Jimmy said quietly. "It's not over. It's just beginning, but not the way you think." He turned to Officer Delgado. "Officer, I believe you just heard a confession to child endangerment and extortion in front of multiple witnesses on school property." Delgado, who'd clearly been waiting for exactly this kind of legitimate, actionable opening, was already moving. "Marcus Webb, turn around, hands behind your back." What followed happened fast. Marcus's attempt to bolt cut short immediately by two officers who'd been quietly positioning themselves throughout the standoff. The remaining kings scattering in every direction the moment handcuffs appeared. Tyler Brooks standing frozen on the lawn, with tears finally streaming down his bruised face, the weight of what he'd just done crashing down on him all at once. Emily ran to him without thinking, dropping to her knees on the grass, pulling the trembling boy into her arms. "You're okay. You're okay, Tyler. You did the right thing. I promise you did the right thing." "I was scared," Tyler choked out against her shoulder. "I've been so scared for so long." "I know." Emily held him tighter, her own eyes burning. "I know, sweetheart. It's over now. It's actually over." Behind them, Jimmy Henderson watched the scene with an expression Emily couldn't quite name, something between satisfaction and a deep old kind of sorrow. The look of a man who'd seen this particular kind of fear in children before and never stopped hating it. "Earl," Jimmy said quietly. "Yeah, boss." "Get me everything we know about every name on that watch list. Every King's affiliate operating anywhere near this school. I want a full picture by tonight." "You got it." Marcus Webb was loaded into the back of a patrol car, still shouting threats that grew increasingly desperate as the reality of his situation set in, while the remaining bystander kings melted away into the morning like smoke, none of them willing to risk being next. Patterson stood frozen on the lawn, watching the entire confrontation with the slack-jawed expression of a man witnessing his school's 6-year nightmare collapse in the span of 15 minutes. He started, then stopped, then tried again. "I have requested intervention from the district for 3 years. 3 years and nothing. You showed up for one morning and that's because you were asking the wrong people," Jimmy said simply, walking back toward Emily and Tyler. He crouched down to the boy's eye level, his massive frame folding with surprising gentleness. "Son, look at me." Tyler lifted his tear-streaked face, eyes wide and uncertain. "What you just did took more courage than most grown men I've ridden with for 30 years. Jimmy said, his voice softer than Emily had heard it all morning. "You understand that you stood up in front of the person who hurt you and told the truth anyway. That's not small, that's not nothing. That's the bravest thing that's happened on this street today, and 180 of us just watched you do it." Tyler's lower lip trembled. "He's not going to hurt my sister now, right? He's really gone. He's not going to hurt anybody," Jimmy said firmly. "And I promise you, son, the people who were supposed to be running with him, watching your back from a distance, they're done too. Every single one of them." Emily looked up at Jimmy over Tyler's head, something fierce and grateful and overwhelmed all tangled together behind her eyes. "Jimmy, don't thank me yet," Jimmy said quietly, standing back up, his eyes drifting once more toward the school building, toward the windows still crowded with students who'd just watched everything unfold in real time. We're not finished here. Within the hour, the street had transformed entirely. Police tape cordoned off a small section near the front entrance, more for procedural reasons than any actual danger, while officers took statements from Tyler, from Emily, from Principal Patterson, who seemed to age 5 years over the course of one morning. The motorcycles hadn't moved, though the energy among the riders had shifted from tense readiness to something closer to quiet pride, brothers exchanging low conversations, a few of them clearly recording the scene on their own phones, capturing footage that would eventually find its way into chapter newsletters and club legend for years to come. Emily sat on the curb beside Tyler, a blanket someone had produced from somewhere draped over his shoulders despite the relatively warm morning, more for comfort than necessity. The boy had stopped crying but still trembled occasionally, the adrenaline crash hitting him in waves. "You're going to be okay," Emily told him for what felt like the 10th time. "I'm going to call your mom myself, and I'm going to make sure the school knows exactly what kind of bravery you showed today." "Will I get in trouble for leaving the classroom during lockdown?" Emily almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "No, Tyler. I think today of all days, that's the very last thing anyone's going to worry about." A shadow fell over them, and Emily looked up to find Jimmy standing there, Big Earl a step behind him, both men looking down at Tyler with an odd protective intensity that Emily found strangely moving. "Tyler Brooks," Jimmy said like he was testing the name out loud, committing it permanently to memory. "I want you to know something. You ever feel unsafe again? Not might happen. Not maybe if anybody ever comes near you or your sister trying to finish what Marcus Webb started. You tell Ms. Carter, and Ms. Carter tells me. You understand?" Tyler's eyes widened. "You mean it. I don't say things I don't mean, son. Ever." Emily watched this exchange with her chest aching in a way she didn't fully understand yet. Watching a 15-year-old boy who'd spent a month terrified into silence finally exhale like a weight had genuinely lifted off him. Patterson approached again, more composed now, though still visibly shaken. "Ms. Carter, Mr. Henderson, the superintendent, is 15 minutes out. I imagine she's going to have a great many questions." "I imagine she will," Jimmy agreed without concern. "I don't know how I'm supposed to explain any of this in a way that doesn't sound completely insane." "You explain it simply," Jimmy said. "Tell her a gang that's been terrorizing your students for 3 years just got its leadership arrested on multiple felony counts in front of 100 witnesses with zero violence and zero cost to the district. Tell her whatever security gap the budget couldn't cover, it just got covered anyway." He paused, glancing toward Emily with something unreadable in his expression. "Tell her exactly how it started, too. Don't leave that part out." Patterson followed his gaze to Emily, and something shifted in the principal's expression, not quite shame, but close to it, the recognition of 6 years spent telling a dedicated teacher that her concerns were above his pay grade, while she kept showing up anyway, kept protecting kids anyway, kept doing the jobs nobody else seemed willing to do properly. "Emily," Patterson said quietly, "I owe you an apology, a long overdue one." Emily looked up at him, too emotionally wrung out to summon the satisfaction she might have felt on any other day. "Let's just focus on the kids, Patterson. That's always been the point." Sirens approached again in the distance, not the chaotic, panicked wail from earlier, but something steadier, more procedural, the superintendent's motorcade finally arriving to assess a situation that had already impossibly resolved itself. Jimmy crouched down once more beside Tyler, lowering his voice so only the boy and Emily could hear. "I need you to do something for me, Tyler. Can you do that?" Tyler nodded eagerly. "I need you to keep being exactly as brave as you were today. Not for me, not for the club, for yourself. You hear me? I'll try. Don't try. Do it." Jimmy's voice carried the same unshakable certainty he'd used on Marcus Webb minutes earlier, except now it was wrapped in something gentler, something almost paternal. "You've got people watching your back now that weren't watching it yesterday. That's not pressure, son. That's permission. Permission to stop being scared." Emily watched Tyler's face shift, watched something settle into place behind his eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago, and she felt the full weight of everything that had happened since 11:40 the previous night crash over her at once. A forgotten wallet, a tired teacher's instinct toward decency, and now an entire gang's 3-year reign collapsing in a single chaotic, miraculous morning. She looked up and found Jimmy watching her, something unspoken passing between them, and somewhere behind that look she understood with sudden and complete clarity that this still wasn't finished. Not the arrests, not the watch schedule. Something else was coming, something Jimmy clearly hadn't said yet, something that made Big Earl shift his weight and glance toward the line of bikes like he was waiting for a signal. "Jimmy," Emily said slowly, "what aren't you telling me?" Jimmy's expression softened into something almost like a smile. "Let's get Tyler back inside to his mother first. Then there's one more thing the club wants to do, and Emily, I think you're going to want to be standing right there when we do it." Tyler's mother arrived 20 minutes later, a thin woman in a fast food uniform who'd clearly left work mid-shift the moment the school called her, and the sight of her sprinting across the lawn toward her son, gathering him up like she could fold him back inside her body and keep him safe forever, was enough to make even Big Earl look away and clear his throat. Emily stood back and let the moment belong to them. Tyler's mother held her son's face in both hands, checking the bruise, checking his eyes, asking question after question in a voice cracking with relief and fury in equal measure. When she finally looked up and saw Jimmy standing nearby, she froze. "Are you the one who—" She didn't finish the sentence, didn't seem to know how. "Ma'am, your son is the bravest person on this street today," Jimmy said quietly. "Not me. Him." She crossed the grass in 3 quick steps, and before Jimmy could react, threw her arms around his middle, her head barely reaching his chest, sobbing into his leather vest, like he was the only solid thing left standing in a world that had nearly taken her child's safety away from her. Jimmy stood stiffly for a second, clearly unaccustomed to this particular kind of gratitude, before his arms came up slowly and he patted her back with surprising gentleness. "He's safe now," Jimmy said. "I promise you that." Emily watched throat tight and felt Patterson come to stand beside her. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like this in my entire career," he admitted quietly. "Neither have I," Emily said, "and I've been here 6 years. Liam." The superintendent arrived not long after a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Reyes, who took one look at the scene motorcycles police tape a sobbing mother and 180 bikers standing in disciplined silence, and demanded a full briefing before she'd say a single word to the press already gathering at the edge of the block. Patterson walked her through it as best he could, stumbling over the strangeness of his own story even as he told it, and Dr. Reyes's expression shifted from disbelief to something more complicated as the pieces fell into place. By the time he finished, she was staring at Emily with an intensity that made the teacher want to disappear into the pavement. "You're the one who paid for his meal," Dr. Reyes said slowly. "I didn't know who he was," Emily said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. I wasn't trying to start anything." "I know." Dr. Reyes' voice softened unexpectedly. "Ms. Carter, I've sat through 3 budget meetings this year where security funding for this school got cut because there wasn't enough to go around. I've read your emails, all of them. I want you to know that." Emily blinked. "You read them. Every one." Dr. Reyes glanced toward Jimmy, toward the bikes, toward the entire impossible scene unfolding on a Tuesday morning that was already going to be retold 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different students before the day ended. "I just never had an answer for you. Apparently the universe found one without me." "It wasn't the universe," Jimmy said, stepping closer, extending a hand. "It was Emily. The rest of this is just interest on a debt." Dr. Reyes shook his hand slowly, sizing him up with the practiced caution of someone who'd spent a career navigating difficult men in difficult rooms. "Mr. Henderson, I appreciate whatever this is truly, but I can't have unsanctioned groups patrolling school property. There are liability concerns, legal concerns. We won't set foot on school property," Jimmy said evenly. "Public sidewalks, public streets, nothing more. Same as any neighborhood watch. You want to call your lawyers and double-check this within our rights, go ahead. I'll wait." Dr. Reyes studied him for a long moment, then exhaled some of the rigidity leaving her shoulders. "I have a feeling fighting you on this would be a losing battle." "You'd be right. Then I suppose," she said slowly, "the district will simply have to express its gratitude for the community's increased vigilance." A small, tired smile crossed her face. "Off the record, Mr. Henderson, thank you. On the record, I never said that." By early afternoon, the police had finished their statements. The press had gotten their footage of motorcycles lined up outside a high school under a headline that would read very differently by morning, and the formation of bikes began finally to break apart. Brothers swinging back onto their machines in 2s and 3s, engines coughing to life one after another. Emily stood near the front steps with Jimmy watching the slow exodus, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel after a morning that started in terror. A strange, hollow kind of peace, the quiet that comes after a storm, finally passes through and leaves the air clean. This is the part where you tell me it was nice knowing me and ride off into the sunset, Emily said, only half joking. Not quite. Jimmy reached into his vest and pulled out a thick envelope, worn at the corners, clearly handled by many hands overnight. He held it out to her. This is from the club, all of us. Every chapter that wrote out this morning chipped in. Emily took it carefully, feeling the weight of it, before she even opened the flap. Her fingers went numb when she saw the bundled cash inside, more money than she'd ever held in her hands at once. Jimmy, I can't, what is this? $42,000, he said simply. For the school. Not for you personally unless you want a cut for yourself, which frankly you have earned 10 times over. But the club voted. We want it going toward whatever this place actually needs. Security cameras, after-school programs, books. Whatever keeps another Tyler Brooks from ending up alone in a hallway with nobody to protect him. Emily stared at the envelope, then up at Jimmy, her eyes burning. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Jimmy's voice had gone rough, quieter than she'd heard it all day. Use it for the kids. That's the only payment that matters to me. Patterson, who'd wandered close enough to overhear, went pale all over again. $42,000, he repeated faintly. Do you understand what that could do for the school cameras at every entrance? A real security position fully funded. Tyler's mother could use help too. If she needs it, we could. That's exactly the kind of thinking I was hoping for. Jimmy said, a faint smile finally breaking through. Use it wisely. We'll be watching to make sure you do. A ripple of nervous laughter passed between Patterson and Emily, the first genuinely light moment either of them had felt all day. As the last of the bikes prepared to roll out, Emily found herself walking Jimmy to his motorcycle. Neither of them quite ready to end the conversation, both aware that whatever had started over a forgotten wallet had become something neither of them fully had words for yet. Can I ask you something? Emily said. Go ahead. Why me really? You could have just paid me back. $20 a thank you card, something simple. Why all this? Jimmy considered the question for a long moment, his hand resting on the handlebar of his bike, his eyes distant, like he was sorting through 30 years of memory to find the right answer. Because the world's full of people who let something bad happen right in front of them as long as it doesn't cost them anything. He said finally, I've seen it my whole life. Good people standing by while somebody gets hurt, telling themselves it's not their business, it's above their pay grade, somebody else's problem. His eyes met hers, steady and certain. You didn't do that, not last night, and from what I've learned about you, not ever. That's worth more than $20 could ever cover. Emily felt her throat tighten again. I just did what felt right. That's exactly my point. Jimmy swung his leg over the bike, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. Most people don't, Emily. Most people talk themselves out of it. You didn't even pause. What happens now with the school, I mean? The watch schedule, all of it. Now, you keep doing what you've always done, Jimmy said, teaching these kids, standing between them and trouble when it comes. Except now, you've got people behind you who'll make sure trouble thinks twice before it comes looking. Big Earl pulled up alongside them, engine idling. Boss, we're ready to roll when you are. Jimmy nodded, then looked back at Emily one final time. You ever need anything, and I mean anything, Emily Carter, you ask around for the Hells Angels. They'll find me. Debt like this doesn't expire. I don't even know how to thank you for this. You already did, Jimmy said. $18.50 12 hours ago. Everything since then was just us catching up. He pulled his sunglasses down, gave her one last nod, and revved the engine. Around them, the rest of the formation came alive, in a wave engine after engine roaring to life, until the whole street thundered with the sound of 180 motorcycles preparing to leave as suddenly as they'd arrived. Emily stood on the curb and watched them go. Watched Jimmy Henderson lead his brothers down the street, and around the corner, the sound slowly fading into the distance, until Roosevelt High School sat in something it hadn't experienced in 3 long years. Silence that didn't feel dangerous. Silence that felt for the first time like peace. The weeks that followed unfolded like something out of a dream Emily kept waiting to wake up from. True to Dr. Reyes's word, the district fast-tracked security upgrades using the club's donation cameras at every entrance within 10 days, a new full-time security officer hired by the end of the month, an after-school tutoring program launched using leftover funds that Tyler Brooks was among the first to sign up for. The East Side King stripped of leadership after Marcus Webb's arrest and the cascade of charges that followed. Once investigators started pulling threads, simply evaporated from Roosevelt High's hallways. A few stragglers tried to maintain a presence in the first week, only to find themselves quietly, consistently deterred by the steady rotation of leather-vested men who appeared on the sidewalks outside school, morning and afternoon exactly as promised, never threatening, never confrontational, simply present. Tyler Brooks walked the hallways differently after that. Emily noticed it within the first week, the way his shoulders came up instead of curling inward, the way he started raising his hand in class again, the particular lightness that comes back into a child's face when fear finally stops living there, full time. I got an A on my history paper, he told her proudly one afternoon, 3 weeks after the morning that changed everything. I saw, Emily said, smiling. You finally figured out the thesis statement. I had a good teacher. Tyler hesitated, then added, and I'm not scared walking home anymore. My mom says it's because of you, because of what you did at that diner. Emily felt a familiar ache rise in her chest, the one that came every time someone tried to credit her for something that had grown so far beyond her original simple act of decency. It wasn't just me, Tyler. It was you too. You were the one brave enough to tell the truth. I wouldn't have been brave enough without knowing somebody had my back. Emily didn't have a response for that. She just nodded, watched him walk off toward his next class with a confidence that hadn't existed in him a month earlier, and felt not for the first time the strange and humbling weight of having started something she never could have predicted. Patterson changed too in ways Emily hadn't expected. The man who'd once told her concerns were above his pay grade became almost overnight the school's loudest advocate for additional resources, pushing the district for permanent funding, increases, citing Roosevelt High's transformation as proof that intervention worked when people actually committed to it. I should have listened to you years ago, he told her one evening, both of them staying late grading the kind of paperwork that never seemed to end. I let the budget excuse become a wall I hid behind instead of something I actually fought against. You're fighting now, Emily said. That's what mattered. It shouldn't have taken 180 motorcycles to make me do it. Emily allowed herself a small, tired smile. No, it shouldn't have, but it did, and the kids are safer for it. I'll take the win. Emily never saw Jimmy again in person after that morning, though she heard from him exactly once 3 months later in the form of a handwritten note delivered by a young prospect she didn't recognize who handed it to her, wordlessly outside the school gates, and rode off before she could even thank him. The note was short, written in blunt, careful handwriting that matched the man perfectly. Heard the school's doing better. Heard Tyler made honor roll. Good. Debt's paid, but the watch never stops. You ever need anything, you know where to find us. Jimmy Emily kept the note folded in her desk drawer alongside the worn schedule sheet from that first impossible morning, a small permanent reminder that kindness, even the smallest kind, the kind that costs $18.50 and takes 30 seconds to offer, could ripple outward in ways no one could ever predict. Some mornings, walking into the school parking lot before the sun had fully risen, Emily would catch sight of a single motorcycle parked across the street, engine quiet rider, unmoving, watching the building with the same patient attention Jimmy had shown that very first day. She never learned all their names. She never needed to. The presence alone was enough, a silent promise kept day after day, long after the cameras and the headlines had moved on to other stories. Roosevelt High School slowly became something Emily had stopped believing it could ever be again. Hallways where kids walked without flinching. Teachers who stayed late without fear of who might be waiting outside. A building that had spent 3 years surviving and was finally cautiously beginning to thrive. And every single time Emily Carter looked back on the night that started it all, she never once thought of it as an act of heroism. She thought of it the only way she ever had, as the simplest, most obvious choice in the world. A man needed help. She had the means to give it. Nothing about that required courage in her mind, only decency. But Jimmy Henderson had known something Emily hadn't fully understood that night. In the diner, that decency, Zheng of the kind that asks for nothing in return, is rarer and more powerful than almost anything else in this world. It is the kind of quiet, unremarkable goodness that, when answered properly, can summon 180 motorcycles to a school's front door, can topple a gang that terrorized children for 3 years, can turn a frightened, silenced boy into someone brave enough to speak the truth in front of strangers, and can remind an entire community all at once that kindness offered without condition never truly goes unanswered. Emily Carter kept teaching, kept grading papers late into the night at the same corner booth at Pop's Diner where Donna still brought her coffee without being asked and never once let her pay for a refill again. Kept standing between her students and whatever trouble came their way, because that was simply who she was and always had been. But she never again felt like she was standing alone. And somewhere out on the open road, 180 brothers carried with them the memory of the morning they rode for a debt that money could never repay, proof etched permanently into the legend of their club. That one act of unflinching kindness offered to a stranger who needed it most had been enough to change everything.